It's in the history. It's in the air. Burt Williams met George Walker there. It's in the air.
Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest on this episode is Lara Allen, and I'll begin by reading the bio from her website. Lara Allen's work has its roots in experimental performance, when at the age of 18, she dropped out of high school and formed the band Manwich in Cincinnati. Later, she moved to San Francisco, where she played and recorded with numerous bands, including Heavenly Ten Stems, Secret Chiefs 3, Carolina Rainbow, and Ragtime Germs. During that time, she developed a visual art practice that resulted in receiving an MFA in painting from Yale, where her work took on dimensions of text, performance, and painting. And I'll mispronounce some of these names, but shows include the Museo de Bellas Artes in Cuba, for the Havana Biennial, Queens Museum, New York, CAC in Cincinnati, MoCA, Cleveland, San Francisco City Hall, Eastern State Penitentiary, Brooklyn Museum, and SF MoMA. Now, I first interviewed Lara Allen back in 2017 for the book, and a lot of that material definitely did make its way into the book in chapters on Carolina and elsewhere, but there was a lot else in that interview that was interesting despite being outside the scope of the book. And so when I reached out to her to do this podcast interview, it was really more with that stuff in mind. In other words, not to rehash what we already talked about, particularly the controversy surrounding the Heavenly Ten Stems and the so-called yellow paint incident. Not to rehash any of that, but really to hear more about her experiences both before moving to San Francisco and then after moving on from the scene talked about in the book. So after she left Carolina in 1994 and after the Heavenly Ten Stems dissolved around that same time. That said, we certainly do connect things back to her time in San Francisco, particularly the early 90s, but also late 90s after she left the aforementioned bands. So we cover a lot of ground. Without any further ado, though, I'll go ahead and get out of the way and let us get on with the interview. So thank you again to Lara Allen, and hope you enjoy. To begin, I thought you had an interesting story of that was kind of representative in a certain way, but also unique in terms of like what led you out to San Francisco. And I believe you spent time in Minneapolis and Ohio in one order or the other. And I can't quite remember though.
Sure. So I was born in Cincinnati and I lived there till I was 18. And I ended up moving to Minneapolis, but I would say in Cincinnati that definitely around the time of being a teenager, sort of into adulthood, like 17, 18, I branched out musically and found people who were really, really into underground music but beyond that, I was introduced to things like the Butthole Surfers, the Fall, Jonathan Richman, things like that, a song by the Mekons or the Swans or the Birthday Party, all that kind of stuff. So that was really a revelation. But then it was this person, his name's David Lewis, and he's a real character, and we were in a band together. He had a show on WAIF, which was the independent radio station, and it was called Art Damage. And on Art Damage, and he had it with Dan Williams, and they had a band called the 11,000 Switches. And David was really he's how do I explain David Lewis? It's really hard to explain, but anyway, he introduced me to so much music. And we were in a band together, and he was really he's absolutely by far the most eclectic musicologist I've ever met, and continues to be. And although at the same time he's a scholar of a certain kind of classical music at this point, but that's beyond what his influence was on me at the time. And he would play things for me, like he was the person who played for me at like as a teenager, Patty Waters, for example. And he used to work with Teddy and the Frat Girls. I think they were originally known as Sheer Smegma. They were originally known as Sheer Smegma, but he would tell me stories about Cookie Mold, the lead singer of that band. And I was really enamored with her. And I was also introduced to Teenage Jesus and the Jerks through him. And he was a huge, and probably still is a huge, Lydia Lunch fan, and just introduced me to a lot of really amazing music and artists that I may not. Now, Lydia Lunch would fit into the whole, category that I mentioned before, like Birthday Party or The Fall or something like that. But he also, I think it was also, I mean, I hate to say it, but it was also female artists that I was introduced at that time that really blew my mind. And so he would be playing. So he had this Art Damage show at WAIF, and they would play things. I mean, anything went. They'd play Easy Listening, Religious, Pill. They would be skipping around all these genres. And they would play anything. I mean, I could go on the show and I brought records and could play what I wanted to with them. And my friend Andrew Rush, who was in San Francisco at the time and was in the Wandering Stars, he used to do cut-ups at home and they would play them there. And, he went under the name Healing Service. So it was just really this community of, I would have to say, weirdos. Other than, I mean, Andrew had come out of being a born again Christian. I was at the point where I had come out of, some serious institutionalized indoctrination into this kind of world, this sort of corporate / medical world. And David, had a lot of things going on in his life and times. But then, so all these were my friends. And then David and I were in a band together. So I started a band before actually I was really close to David. I started a band that was more in the sort of fall and post-punk and no wave genre with Bill Weber. And he and myself, Bill William has since gone on to play with Gigi Allen and others. Anyway, Chrome Cranks. And so he and I started a band, and we were with this guy, Darius Smith and Pete Aaron, who anyway, this is Cincinnati. This is San Francisco. But
okay.
we had a band. Yeah. We had a band called Manwich. And Manwich, fortunately, now Pete was the first bass player, but he dropped out. We got this guy named Joel. Bill joined David Lewis joined the band. My dear friend Wendy Darst, at the time joined the band, played Farfisa. Heather Prescott. We got 2 drummers. So, and we were improvisation, and it was a mess. And I think at times at its best, it was a cacophony of super weirdness. And at its worst, it was annoying and just like, oh my God, when are they going to stop? But we were experimental. And that was my beginning of performing. So it was just improvising, getting up, grabbing a mic and just singing or talking or doing whatever. So it was really quick. There was Cincinnati. There wasn't a lot of this going on. So when the Butthole Surfers came to town, we opened for them. When Pussy Galore came to town, we played with them. Any band that was in that ilk, we would play with them because there really wasn't it wasn't much in town. There were other bands with BPA and Human Zoo and stuff like that, but we were one of very few experimental or more in that post-punk. So It was strange because when I was around 18, so I played in front of hundreds of people, and, I would meet people and they would always talk to me about the band. And I thought I was again, I had just gotten out of being in some pretty serious situations psychologically. I found it potentially dangerous for me to get so much attention. And I thought that it would ruin me it would make me really egotistical, and that, I needed to get away. And I mean, was kind of fucked up. So I was scared. I was scared of, in a way, my own ideas of myself or whatever image I had of myself getting away from me and turning into, oh, that's a girl that screams in the band, or that never faces the audience, or blah, 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 blah. And so I moved to Minneapolis. And what was strange to me there was a lack of experimental, subversive music. Everybody was either like, oh, I prefer Husker Du, or I prefer the Replacements. And that conversation seemed really, I'd seen both of them, and I was like, whatever. And it wasn't as like creative as something like the Butthole Surfers, in my mind, or as raunchy as Pussy Galore, or on and on. So going to Minneapolis was an eye-opening experience. And at the same time, I said, oh my God, I dropped out of college. I did a lot of drugs really young. My brain is going to suffer. So I went to community college, and I tried to read books and study art. I was reading books on Marcel Duchamp, or I was looking at classical. I was studying classical music. I mean, I was trying whatever I could. I mean, to survive. I thought, shit, I'm in this world alone. I got to figure this out. I got a brain, whatever. And so I lived alone in Minneapolis, and there was a direness to it because, I was 20 or whatever. And my friends and such were in bands that were, again, kind of in the ilk that I felt like I was moving away from. It wasn't, or that I wasn't really that into, the kind of like bass guitar, drums. And so there was one band that I loved, were the Cows in Minneapolis. And that was as weird as it got there at the time, were the Cows. So, okay, so I was in Minneapolis, and I was working at record stores. So I was getting really obscure records, like soundtracks. And I worked for this guy. He was so sweet. I was at the Uptown seeing some generic band, and this guy sat down next to me and was like, hey, can I buy you a drink? And I was there by myself. I'm like, sure. And I get a drink, and he's like, so what's your favorite music? And I said, well, Jelly Roll Morton. And he's like, do you want a job? So I got a job at a record store from this guy, Jaime, who at the time he was in this record store, Jaime and Hazen's in Minneapolis. And, that's a great job as someone who needed a job, I guess. And also just collecting records and books, because it was records and books. And it went from Jaime's and Hazen's to just Jaime's. And it was attached to Ingmar Lee's, which was a 78 store. So I was in a very fortunate situation with Jaime, who was very generous with me and, gave me a lot of records, let me take books home. And I was just constantly listening to records and looking at, he liked those 40s and 50s kind of sci-fi books, especially the ones like you turn the cover over and there's a different cover on the back. So I'm surrounded by all these amazing images. He was a jazz beau, so there was I was exposed to a lot, hence Jelly Roll Morton. Oh, do you want a job? And getting, so so I was getting exposed to a lot of different kind of music, a lot of female vocalists that I was really into, that I hadn't heard before, and other vocalists, international music, but soundtracks was a big deal. And then just obscurities, weird organ records or things with goofy covers. And we would go thrift shopping and find things. So that was a great experience. But Andrew Rush came to visit in San Francisco, and he was like, "You got to get out of here." And he was going to Romania and said, "You got to sublet my apartment and you have to move to San Francisco." And I took a bus because he and I were taking a bus. I was going there to visit him. And before I even got there, I decided I was going to move there. And in 3 months, I ended up figuring out a way to get myself there and get my records and stuff there. So yeah, that was a feat. And I moved to San Francisco then. So that was the trajectory, or that was how I got to San Francisco and where my head was, because in Minneapolis, I was dead in the water. No one gave a shit about me being a singer or being a musician or being anything. I mean, in fact, yeah, it was not. And that was kind of a big blow, from going to this place where I was accepted and lauded, and then being kind of like, "Who are you? Who the fuck are you?" And so San Francisco was great because it has a darkness, the fog moving in, but it also has this incredible beauty of living in a national park feeling. It was cheap. It was just chock full of subversive energy and people and bands. And so I went to the 6th Street Rendezvous. It was open for 2 seconds at that time. And I think I was seeing Tragic Mulatto, and Grux and Christina, his girlfriend at the time, came up to me and talked to me. And then I became friends with Grux. And was telling him about organ records, I'm really into organ records and band organs. And he said, "I want to introduce you to my friend Robert." And Robert Heilbuth.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was a whole nother world. But Robert Heilbuth, who was in his 70s at the time and had escaped Nazi Germany and had built a band organ, built a pipe organ. Everything in his house was handmade. And he was a piano tuner by trade, but a composer and he was Mr. Natural come to life. You would go to his house and he would smell you before you came in. And he would just say, "Shit." He knew Crumb Comics. He liked them. So I think he also played it up, but he had that long beard, and he was a real, I would say, one of my, I felt like he was one of the dearest people that I'd known, and kept my feet grounded in a kind of reality that I think I would have been hard pressed to have found from anyone else and anywhere else.
I'm glad you mentioned him. There are all, I'm glad you mentioned Andrew Rush as well. Andrew Rush's name does appear. Robert Heilbuth, I'm realizing, doesn't. There's all these things, no matter how.
Robert doesn't. Oh my gosh!
No,
yeah.
I know that. Well,
No. That's okay.
Well, there's all these. There's always.
He always
omissions.
said, "I don't want groupies." He always said, he was hilarious that way. Like, I don't want anybody. He was anyway. Sorry, go ahead.
Was he still performing?
He never performed. He never performed. His performances were going to the store and talking to the manager. I mean, he didn't. No. And he rarely invited people over. He didn't. No. He was not an easy person to get to know at all. He would say, "I don't want groupies," and he wasn't wrong in a way. He didn't want. Well, it's funny to think about groupies of a person who writes compositions for band organs and makes instruments, but Yeah, I mean, he selected who he wanted to be around, and there was kind of a it was on his terms, and yeah, you had to pass the smell test to be around Robert. No, he never performed. I mean, he only had his job as a piano tuner and getting by, and his band organ, and he didn't even make recordings until right before his death. I have cassette tapes of them. He wouldn't allow it. And then finally he met somebody who recorded and talked him into it. And, he could kind of be coaxed and persuaded, but it was all under his terms. I think that now there's a video on YouTube. Someone showed me years back that there's actually a short video, but there's not much about Robert in the stratosphere and he wanted it that way. He used to say, Beethoven's dead, or no, he used to tell me Rembrandt is dead, let him be dead. And it wasn't that he didn't like Rembrandt. It was just a philosophy about life and death, and I think also people being overly dramatic about who they like and love and admire, and what that does to the person who they're admiring too.
Yes, but when you first mentioned introducing you to my friend who plays organ, I thought you were going to say his name was Anton, but with Grux, but Anton LaVey, but because that's another organ player that Grux was friends with.
Yeah, and Robert knew him, and they knew
okay.
each other. Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's a small world, and in the organ, eccentric
Yeah,
in
I
San
mean
Francisco.
I mean it's bigger in San Francisco than and other places. It would basically be non-existent, but yeah, septuagenarian, eccentric organ, keyboard, esoteric. Yeah. Anyway, so I imagine
There's one in Cincinnati. There was one in Cincinnati. I mean, there was like one in every town. Maybe no. I mean, there was probably there were probably 100, or 200 or 300. That's one of the things I think about. Who are those people going to be? But anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead. What was your question?
Well, so I didn't. So that when we first talked, so I recalled from what you were saying just now. I remembered some of the names like Man, which I would not have been able to remember off the top of my head. But I didn't know quite as much. You hadn't told me quite as much about that time in Minneapolis, and that you were already into a lot of this different kind of music. And I'm thinking here. By the time if you get to San Francisco and you start meeting people like Grux and they're talking about organ records, what it was like to feel like you must have felt like, wow, like I'm meeting people like this, or I'm looking in a mirror, or not looking in a mirror, but meeting people who have these interests. And did it surprise you, or did it feel kind of like what you expected as far as being able to come across all these things that
Yeah.
I think, and the other reminder that I give myself, or maybe listeners, is that that this stuff was pretty hard to come across at the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you weren't an obscurient, you weren't going to know this stuff, and it was also not popular. If it was you, and here's the thing: I think in a way you had to have you had to genuinely like it. I think that, or why else would you listen to it? And so it made me think about Dr. Demento. Growing up as a kid, I heard Dr. Demento shows on the radio, and it's like, what kind of amount of glee did you get from Dr. Demento, or also Spike Jones, and that kind of chaotic play. Anyway, so or even you could say something like Edgar Varese or something like, in a more artful way. But that's more educated. I'm talking about like popular, lowbrow. So anyway, when I was conflicted, and this is strange because, first of all, I hadn't been around so many obsessive record collectors. I knew David Lewis, and he wasn't a record collector. He was he's a different animal, and there's no one like him. And his name is actually, one time I called him Uncle Dave, and it's stuck. So he goes by Uncle Dave now. But anyway, he was different. But this was and Andrew Rush was a collector too, but I didn't look at him that way. And he also collected a lot of stuff. He used to make fun of me and kind of torture me a little, because some of the stuff I wasn't into, and I could be really honest with him, and we would just crack up. And it was really fun. But when I started seeing a kind of like a strange sort of bartering, and a kind of like obsessive and almost ego driven kind of thing, it weirded me out a little bit. And I don't know how to talk about this without sounding like accusatory, judgmental, anything like that. And was also reflective of myself, because I also felt like there was something really personal happening, because when I was in Minneapolis collecting weird records, I didn't know anybody doing that. And so it felt like, wow, nobody else is doing. I mean, okay, granted, here goes like, I'm not going to break my arm patting myself on the back, but I thought like, nobody's into this stuff. And it felt like saving something that was lost, or that might be lost, or that no one cared about, like this stuffed animal that's like half ripped, and you like find it on the street, and you're like, I'm going to love you forever. So this was a little strange. I also felt like I was doing a job that really didn't need to be done. So I still continued to collect records, but I also it was more like I couldn't always tell you names. And I could never tell you serial numbers of 78s, but I could, but it was like it was still like it was actually more of a spirit. It was a spirit that I was after, hence the Jelly Roll Morton. There was a spirit. When I first heard that, I knew something I didn't know before, and it was about a spirit that existed. So then meeting people, I just wasn't sure that it was necessarily aligned in the same way. And it was mostly, if not all, guys, which is cool. I mean, I like them, but I think that their approach was just different. And it was fun. It was really fun to meet erudite collectors and have them. They do know the serial numbers, and they can rattle off every player on the record and do all that. But that just, to me, got into a different sort of realm than the spirit of what had happened in the sound. So, okay, so that's a complicated answer, but hopefully in there is some kind of, you can pan out, some kind of like relationship to what it was like to sharing that with, and I loved sharing it with people. It wasn't that I didn't like to share it. It was just in a different kind of way of exchange, and where the focus was. It's really, I mean, meeting that level of collector, it's really something. That people, that it's profound to meet people who have one copy of something like a 78 that there's no other known copies.
I'm guessing this, by the reference to Tragic Mulatto and 6th Street Rendezvous, I'm putting that around 89?
No, 91.
91.
This was,
okay.
It had closed, the 6th Street Rendezvous, and I don't know by what grace of God that opened for like a month or something, or maybe it was longer. But yeah, it reopened and then it closed. That's the sketchiest of the downtown. There's sketchier places in the Tenderloin for sure, but that was the sketchiest block. And yeah, it was just open for a few shows, or I don't remember, but
Right. And
yeah, yeah,
I can't
or a
quite place
year,
it.
a couple of years.
Yeah. It's not, there were, Rough Trade was located there from about 82 to, I don't know how far into the 80s, but not there, but like within a couple of blocks on 6th Street. So again, for anyone who's been there, you can picture it. If you haven't, and for me, it was culture. It was not just culture shock, it was system shock, sort of. It was
Oh
very,
yeah. It
very
really
different.
is that kind of, all of a sudden the circus has come to town. You're just like in the middle of it in one block. It was so bizarre. Toulon is there. But-
Right. Yeah.
and then it's probably just SRL hotels and dive bars that you may or may not live if not to put too fine a point on it, but it was definitely a a, a place where you're like, um just I don't know,
Yeah.
not going into too far of the corner of the alley by yourself or
Yeah.
something. I don't
Yeah.
know.
And there was a building, I don't know if it was like that in the early 90s, but there was a building that had like bathtubs on the wall or
Oh
different
yeah. Oh
uh
yeah, that was on Mission Street. Yeah, on the
Mission,
something
6th and
like
Mission
that.
maybe. 'Cause I remember, yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, with the stuff coming out and the arms and legs coming out of the windows and the furniture coming out of the
Right.
windows.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it wasn't
Yeah.
bathtubs. It was just a very different. Again, I was coming straight from North Carolina, so maybe Minneapolis. I don't know how Minneapolis and Cincinnati would compare at the time. Maybe Minneapolis a little bigger than Cincinnati, but um, either way, San Francisco is
There's
still pretty different, I imagine.
absolutely. I mean, it's an international city, but it's also the weather. And so it's mostly, though, even more as the history. I mean, San Francisco has it's the Barbary Coast, the Gold Rush. It has that whole incredible history. And living in New York now, I see what diversity actually is. But being in San Francisco, it did feel more diverse than Minneapolis at that time, for sure.
Yeah, and as far as the bands, was Carolina was that the first one that you took part in? I should know
I think
this, but
so. I think it was. Yeah. If I remember correctly, I think it was. And it happened pretty quickly. And it happened almost seamlessly. I don't think everybody was thrilled when I showed up. And Grux introduced me as, I don't know, I was going to play sound effects or something. And that was not necessarily needed or wanted. And then someone quit the band. And then I took over as the bass player, which was also, maybe subpar for what other band members wanted. But once I started singing, that's when I think there was an appreciation for what I had to offer. Or we'll call it singing.
I'm trying to picture kind of maybe something that is too general to picture, but let's say a certain time when there's a kind of a time period in early 90s when there's kind of a feeding frenzy, or there's maybe like a lot more ambition creeping into to underground music. But here at the same time, a lot of people, well, in your circle, and yourself included, are looking to these completely different times and places. Whether it was Southeast Asian pop music or Jelly Roll Morton or whatever.
Or Burt Bacharach. Yeah,
Yeah, in a lot of ways was very out of step, maybe ahead of its time in being out of
definitely.
step. Um,
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that it was, the intention. I think the intention with these bands, everything was was subversive. It definitely wasn't. And I'm not going to say that Kurt Cobain saying everyone is gay and wearing a dress and lipstick wasn't subversive, because it was. It just so happens that they struck a they hit on something, a pulse in popular. So whatever they were influenced by or listening to was probably much more mainstream than what we ever listened. I mean, right or wrong, it was more, traditional hard rock, punk rock, post-punk, etc. And I really doubt they were listening to like kids' organ records seriously and using that for inspiration for their vocals, or channeling. And anyway, you get the idea. So there was a kind of like creativity that was going on that I don't think really involved like just a music scene. I think that if you take most of the bands were a lot of like, we go back, we talked about this like living theater tradition, and you could say indefinitely camp, whether or not that was, camp and the camp version of failed seriousness, or in just artifice and esoteric private code, but there was a lot of that kind of more immersive, experiential output. And the outliers, like for example, Harry Parch, who's somebody who was in San Francisco and is somebody who I've been thinking a lot about. That would have been an example of a musician and an example of this corporeal experience, we'll say, and that is much more resonant for that time period and what people were just excited by. A guitar hook is exciting, but we just needed a little more, or something different, and it had to feel chaotic and again esoteric. So how would that, that doesn't have, sure, grunge chaos, I guess, but those records are really put together. They're really well produced. It's a different animal. It really is.
Yeah, yeah. And I just found it kind of interesting that to kind of looking back on that era when, let's say, Carolina was in full swing, and these spinoffs or associated groups like Job's Daughters and were happening. The media spotlight, Time Magazine is doing these articles about grunge just up the coast in Seattle, and it's just a very, not to say that there weren't mainstreamish type things happening in San Francisco. You have to keep in mind this is kind of a little enclave or a little scene, but it's definitely, I guess if you wanted to talk about people who had ambitions towards kind of making it big, they would not be choosing some of the directions that a lot of y'all were taking. And it was definitely just a different motivation. But you also brought up something that I did
absolutely
kind of remember about, when we first talked, it was 2017, it was summer 2017. And I, still relatively early on in the research. So I did manage to like talk to some other people and learn more about, there's my dog making noise, about the 70s and Angels of Light and things that fed into Tuxedo Moon, and then the influence that they had. There's almost kind of like mentors to other bands, or whether it was Minimal Man or Factory X, and then eventually you have someone like Grux is witnessing some of that firsthand, catching the tail end of some of these performers who were Simon Reynolds referred to it as dark cabaret, but this tradition that was kind of unfolding in parallel with, kind of mixed together with punk in the late 70s, but in another sense, it's its own kind of tradition that is more theater immersive. And that is something that is a San Francisco thing. And one thing that would come up in interviews or just as I would be thinking about this stuff is, how much of this is a particular tradition that one can trace versus this is San Francisco, this place that attracts people looking for something different or getting away or going west. And it's kind of chicken or egg. I don't think there's one specific answer, but that's one of those things that's maybe just kind of like it's in the air or it's in the again non-question.
I do think it's in the air. I do think that it has a particular. I do think it's the weather. I do think it's the history of the place, the Barbary Coast, the Gold Rush, I absolutely the freedom at the time, and up until the late '90s, where you could live relatively inexpensively and experiment and be in a community and speak with a history. Absolutely. I mean, it's also like a seriousness, whether you take it seriously. I remember at the time thinking about New York and how dour it was, and how when I would see all the bands from there wore black leather and had black dyed hair, and I thought, oh my God, how boring. Just, okay, you're cool, whatever. And I like that. Don't get me wrong, but it just seemed like there was a kind of cool factor on the East Coast. It seemed to me repressed, and it also seemed oppressive, and it also seemed depressed, and this freedom of expression and spirit. I don't know, I'm sure people could argue or say a lot about, we could talk a lot about that and what that means and why it was that way there in San Francisco. Different kinds of industry and social economic factors, but it's definitely in the air. It's in the history. It's in the air. Burt Williams met George Walker there. It's in the air.
I did want to ask about, what led you to leave San Francisco, but I know before you left, you had a period where you, I guess you could say, sort of exited the proverbial scene, but were still doing music. And that's when you started working with Craig Ventresco. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate.
Because I know that, or I gather that sort of led to, I don't know if you could say, a new phase in what you were doing. Not a phase, because that sounds like something that's temporary, but that you sort of recommitted yourself or reoriented yourself, I guess you could say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, reoriented. I think that makes a lot of sense, because the kind of, major change, you think, maybe I'm Saturn return. I don't know. Maybe you just I became overly serious. And I became overly serious, and in a way that was, retrospectively, it's fine. For 5 years, all I listened to was music from 1896 to 1917 or something like that. It was limited, being that I'd come from something that was so different in my mind, where there was this openness, and then I became really exclusive and idiosyncratic in a way that was really hard for other people to relate to. It was like I would go to a party and be like, "Why aren't you listening to Ada Jones?" Or which in my mind, it was I took on this intensity of early American music, recorded music, and the importance of it and what it meant. But I really lost a kind of joy for just sound and all sound and all music. And I'm happy to say that I have left the building, and I still have this wealth to draw from of knowledge of that music, that era, those songs, which are absolutely brilliant. And now what I do is I take the songs and I rewrite the lyrics, which is much of what performers did at that time anyway, in a topical way, and perform a cappella with a friend of mine who's an artist who has shows. He has shows, kind of big shows like at the Brooklyn Museum or here or there. We just did a performance together, or I did a performance at his opening. His name's Duke Riley. And he and I, it's not exactly a collaboration. It kind of is. And he called it that, which I appreciated. But I kind of channel into what he's doing, and I tune in the dial and I write a song, and then it sort of explodes in the middle of one of his openings, and that's it. So we've been doing that together since 2009. So while you say a phase, yeah, it's life changes all the time. So,
I didn't mean
there
to say
was
phase is not the right word. I used
no,
that
you
same word
didn't
with
say
Trey.
no, and you said that, and you corrected yourself. But I was like, no, that's actually correct. And I mean, in some ways, I liked the way of orienting, because that really is what it felt like. But in that orientation, instead of having peripheral vision, it became microscopic. And that kind of granular study is not something that brings me joy, because it's so idiosyncratic and it's so exclusive, and there's so few people that you can share it with. And those people tend to be musicians with a capital M. They're really good at music. And that's I'm not a musician with a capital M. I don't understand theory that way or anything like that. So there's a breakdown there where it's a little alienating. And I preferred music community, much more eclectic music community is
Yeah. I was going to say, it sounded like you could have been describing, graduate school, which is what I did after I left San Francisco. But was that in an academic context, or was that on your own that you were studying?
no, it was on my own. Yeah, it was on
Okay.
my own. And it was through record collectors, and yeah, it was absolutely record collectors getting tapes of 78 rare stuff and just listening to them nonstop, and studying guitar and ukulele. I mean, there's one person who I haven't brought up yet who is a real gem in San Francisco, and that's William Wynett. I mean, he's in Oakland, but
Right.
I
Okay.
met
Yeah.
him in San Francisco. And, he's the kind of person I can say, oh, hey, Willie, what Joseph Lamb song do you like? And, he was like, oh, Cleopatra. So I learned Cleopatra on guitar and Cleopatra rag, and played around with him, or like Little Strenuous Life or something by Joplin. So, there are ways to if you get into this, to be out with people who have a more eclectic view and of music. And he's definitely a musician with a capital M. So, but Willie, by the way, I was working on something with Harry Parch, writing something about Harry Parch, and actually using Harry Parch as a kind of way into this kind of overall experience of an artwork, with this writing I've been doing, and letting his music guide this writing into a kind of poetry. Or one hopes. I can't really be the judge of that, but and I was just talking to Willie about Harry Parch. I mean, this is somebody who knew Harry Parch. This is somebody who knew John Cage. This is like, I don't know. I'm a big fan of Willie Wynott, and I consider him a friend, and I feel really fortunate to know him. And I think as far as San Francisco, he had, and Oakland and that whole scene, he has he's a pillar. He plays with Secret Chiefs and stuff like that. You
Right,
probably,
right.
you probably, I don't know if you interviewed him, but
I did
he has,
way back. Yeah.
yeah, he's somebody who I'm thinking of when we're talking about this kind of like looking in more of a studious kind of, or a study kind of way. And I'm not saying the people that I know who are really into that music are at all like that kind of, they're not academics. They're just, musical geniuses who happen to be really into old music.
Right. But I mean, it's understandable in the sense that, first of all, what you told me about that echoed what several other people, maybe from different eras that I interviewed, would say. That basically they did find some reorientation, whether it was taking not
Mm,
taking up going to painting, or realizing, God, I don't want to be in bands anymore, or in the late '70s, early '80s, there were a lot of people getting away from some pretty rough situations, with a lot of people dying from drug overdoses, and realizing that they had to you
yeah,
know
and AIDS. Yep.
yeah, and so, but you had, not to over dramatize it, but kind of a one-two punch from with the Heavenly Tin Stems, and then the disappointment of what happened at the end with Carolina and not being able to go to Japan. And what I gathered was
Mm,
that you were, kind of, I don't know if, like, you woke up one morning and said, I'm done with the scene, TM, but it did seem like you had a moment where it was kind of like, I do need to find something else. And then it makes sense that that might
hmm
have had, maybe that phase, as you call it, was necessary in terms of getting to something else. Maybe you have to decompress, or just you say, I don't want to even
hmm
think about this stuff for a few years. I'm going to go in this other direction, or pursue this more seriously.
hmm
So, but I don't know if that
I'm going to
characterizes it,
pursue experimental music more seriously. No,
or
it,
pursue ragtime, or pursue
no, for sure, for sure.
Americana.
Yeah, yeah. No, it did definitely made this, gave me this seriousness that it. I mean, it. I don't want to get too in on why that's absurd, but it's it's okay. So, but learning is not absurd, and understanding history is not, and getting this kind of knowledge was really, it was a wonderful, I'm using this word again, indoctrination into a world that I hadn't really been introduced to in the kind of seriousness that would be required of someone to really study that music. Now, was I that serious? I tried to be, just in that I was, and it just, like I said, I was never going to be a musician with a capital M. And so in that world of playing like roots music and early early jazz and country, hillbilly, etc., I can't just pick up a guitar and play along to a song that maybe I don't really know. So it didn't really work out for me in terms of playing music with other people. And so then it became, I'm on my own. And so I had that knowledge, and I used that along with this kind of more experimental sort of noise making. I don't make a lot of noise, but I kind of do some more like bringing back this idea of Spike Jones, where things happen that are erratic and create a kind of solo performance. But getting to your thing about that time, I had a very specific way of looking at it. I said, I'm never going to perform again. That's it. And it was extreme, and it was really painful. And it was something that I felt like was a punishment to other people. I mean, no one really was going to care that much. But in my mind, I thought, this is this channeling thing, this thing that's coming, and y'all don't like it or you don't want it. Well, fine, you don't get it. And it sounds really self-important, but it wasn't about me, it was about the spirit. So I repressed that, or I didn't repress it. I sublimated it into painting, which was something that didn't really, it worked to a certain degree, but I ended up in graduate school studying painting. And that was hell because I was in the Ivy League studying painting, and I had all this other stuff that was much more relevant to my creativity than painting was, than like painting, the history of painting. I love it. But as a medium, it was only one of many things, and I wasn't a conceptual artist either. So it wasn't, while I like conceptual art and I appreciate it, the mind was not the key organ. So that I wanted to focus on, or that I was even able to. So painting became, okay, I'm going to paint this stern kind of, that's what I will do. And I did it. But then I got into graduate school and was painting, and it was kind of messy. And so how you relive these sorts of experiences and that kind of repetition. And it was like, oh, I don't have any it was a little bit like going to Minneapolis and being like, oh, I'm alone out here. Like, nobody knows me here. I don't get any passes. I'm not getting into any shows for free. Nobody wants to collaborate. It was like, nobody gives a shit who I am. And I realized at one point that's I don't know, you could call it being like a baby or something, or being like a human who needs to have a community. Because for me, working in creative realms, it's always a conversation. I don't want to have a conversation with myself so much. I
Right.
really don't. And I'm not somebody who's really into like doing that alone. And so unless there's someone outside of myself that it's for, or that I'm communicating with, I don't have the impetus to make work. And if anybody listens to this and anybody else feels like that, and they are have any insight into that, I would be very curious, because most people I know are very self-driven. It doesn't mean I don't have, selfish or ego or any of that. It just means it just comes from a different place. It's almost like, as a kid, everything that I made had to be a gift for someone. I never sat around and was like, I'm going to do a drawing. It was like, we're going to make gifts for each other.
Right. No, yeah.
This is like, yeah. And I know that there's a whole there's something cultural in there that I'm unaware of. And it's, who knows where that comes from, genes or it could be anything.
Right. Well, so much of creativity or art seems to, whether it's music or I don't know much about visual art, but I imagine there's a delicate balance in terms of a social aspect and
Hmm. Hmm.
and then the individual aspect of drilling down and bearing down individually, and different people it's going to work differently, but the
Yeah.
factors that are required for the social aspect to come together, I mean, those are almost like, those are things to do with the zeitgeist, and that are almost
Yes.
magical, and they're very fragile. And I think that
Yes.
that era of early 90s San Francisco that you were out there was one of those really dense eras in terms of a lot of stuff going on, and
Yeah.
like late '70s, early '80s, and mid '80s was not quite as it was a little bit fallow relative to those other
Mhm.
periods in terms of what I traced. But there were a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of things. But again, coming back to kind of maybe the experience of it is it. I imagine you almost have to decompress or move on, and those scenes can't sustain themselves. You can't have I try to imagine what it would be like going on tour with a Caroliner in one's 40s or something, or yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like
Yeah.
you can't do that forever.
Good
And then
point.
right,
Good point.
and then the question
Yeah.
is like, what do you do next? And see, I didn't even realize that you had gone to graduate school, but it's like it's got to be I don't know if lightning in a bottle. Like I feel like you
Yeah.
found a setting that was really well suited to your talents and abilities and interests. And I don't know if it's been a struggle since then to refine it, but to kind of again maybe reorient or. Um, but do you
I'll
feel
tell
that?
you, Will,
Yeah,
no, no, you don't find it. You have it, you get it once in your life,
yeah,
and you get it, and I've never heard myself say this, and I don't want to be nostalgic, sentimental, because that's not going to help the situation. But there's other things that happen, and there's definitely other things happening, and I have to appreciate those, and they're very much building on something that was experienced then. But I think the key for me is to not bemoan what could have been or what was missing. But there is something that I feel that I definitely miss, that zeitgeist. I definitely miss it. And I will always miss it. I will always, always, always miss it. And it's not you. I mean, of course, there's probably youth or whatever involved, but yeah, I think it was the skies parted, the gates opened, and I was welcomed in, and I got in for a few years, and then I kind of got kicked out, or I kicked myself out, or I wore out my welcome, whatever it was, and or the time shifted, and it was it it was not something that can happen again, and it won't happen again. Obviously, time doesn't. That's not the way these things go. But
yeah. It's getting existential. But I mean, if it's any consolation, it just seems like that's all the different people I've talked to or looked at. It's just the nature of these things that
yeah,
they don't last by definition, like
yeah.
like an ocean wave. And then
Oh man, yeah.
bless his heart and everything else. But for someone like Grux to to dig your heels in and entrench oneself in it, it's like I admire it in a sense, but as you told me, that as you put it the first time, that's can be its own trap, and so you can't really
Oh yeah.
freeze it either.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, you can't. Yep, absolutely. And it's you ask yourself, like, well, where do you go from here? And and having that's interesting to think about, because there is a kind of courage in moving through it and moving on to the next, whatever that might be, and seeing different artistic processes and experiences, and meeting different people, and making new work, which may or may not ever be on the level of that. And that that might be hard to take, but I think it's worth the risk. I think it's worth the risk. But it also has to do with your situation, your personality, what you have access to, and how scrappy you are when it comes to creativity it's, I mean, somebody could say like Carolina continuing to exist. There's definitely, there's a persistence there that's certainly admirable. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't listen to the current Carolina records.
Yeah.
I never listen to any of the records. I don't own any of the records. I kind of wish I did, but occasionally I think, which records did I record on? But it doesn't, it's what do you, yeah, what was you were going to say something. I think I
Well, I
cut
don't
you
know.
off.
No, I don't know because I'm just looking at the bio here and realizing I didn't realize, that you had gone to Yale, but just kind of looking at the gestalt of or looking at your website, it's interesting because I could see the range of different things that you've done, and it coheres in a way in that this is, all stuff that you've done, and whether it was anonymously early on or not, but it's it's also kind of a journey, and I guess this is not fair of me to ask these kind of this is your life questions, but I guess I was curious if how much when you think of what you're doing art wise today. You had mentioned, for example, when we last talked, some one woman shows, one that might still be in the works. I'm not sure about some of your experiences as a teenager, but how how do you think of maybe this is, I'm asking you to say something pretentious, but when you think of your art today, how do you think of it in terms
Yeah,
of
I'm sure I'll comply.
in terms of continuity with your, what you were doing back then? How much do you compartmentalize, then versus now, as opposed to thinking, this is all part of some sort of trajectory? Can you see what you're doing in relation to what you were doing in San Francisco in the 90s, or does it feel like, yeah, yeah,
No, I love it. I love that you gave me an invitation to be pretentious. No, and I'm sure, like I said, I'll comply. It's a, it's actually kind of therapy talking to you, Will. Thank you. I think the answer to your question would be there's no way to separate them. And I see from this project that you're doing and my talking to you and being a part of it is allowing me in some ways to see the connection, but also to close the book on that, which feels really nice because there wasn't a ceremonial, okay, well, I did what I came to do, and now it's time for me to get in my air balloon and fly away. It was very sad. It felt unfinished. And this feels to me like a way to circle back and maybe reflect and see how these things weren't separate. And while it may have been painful, not completing that cycle is what kept it sort of as a trauma in myself, because even though we performed another show, like the Heavenly Ten Stems performed another show, that that was that. And then there wasn't like maybe a recording. We could have done recording session or something of those songs. And there were a few that I didn't end up learning that I really wished I would have done. And, just finished that. Had that,
right,
did some recordings. Fortunately, I got to record, God bless Trey, for having me record with him that song. And James Good, who recorded some things, but and also with Carolina had being able to go to Japan. I think that could have completed the circle for me personally. But
right.
but I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate the attention that you're giving to my experience within this time period, because I could easily be whatever, not in your book, not talked to, and that would be another kind of feeling of like there's a cycle that hasn't quite been run through. That's a little bit of like a chain that's broken. And so, yeah, I just want to say that this talk is making me experience these feelings that I think are helping this creative process that I'm going through now. That there is a cohesion that maybe I've been unaware of until this time, that I can now, in a way, maybe close that feeling out inside, because it's really something that is trapped. It's trapped inside, and it is really, it's painful, because when you have that kind of like deep connection to spirit and to music, and to be invited to like explore that to the fullest extent of your being with other people, there's no greater joy in the world. There isn't. I tell me what's better than that. Dancing, maybe, and so I think that I miss it. I miss being with other musicians, because they only make you better. And yeah, I miss it. But it's it's that's life. That's life. and and there's there's definitely a lot going on creatively in New York, and a lot of things that I've been privy to, and I'm really appreciative for. And this is only allowing me to be appreciative for those things now. And yeah, it's making me think of like, what is that quote about toys or something, like childhood toys and da da da. There was very much like you touched on it, like there's very much this kind of living outside of society's expectations and norms, which is maybe much different as a 20-year-old as opposed to a 40-year-old. Sleeping on other people's couches and trying to be normal, and not being normal, and knowing you never will be. And then understanding, oh, you're going to maybe seeing your parents or older people passing away and thinking, am I going to be in a cardboard box on the side of the road? This is the US, people in Europe. And I think the riskiness of the US was something that was really gave a lot of wind to work here, because you really were without a net, and still are. But so much so that I think that it's gotten to really freak people out. I mean, young people are really freaked out.
Thanks again to Lara Allen for doing this interview. To learn more about her, go to laraallen.com.
Oh, in San Francisco, when the weather is bad, they have a dance out there. They're called the grizzly bear. All your other loving dances don't compare. Not so moony, but a little more than spoony. Talk about the dance that old New Orleans got that couldn't class with what old San Francisco's got. Listen, my honey, do, and I will show to you the dance of the grizzly bear. I'll come close to your lady. Tony Schultz told us, Lordy, what I feel. Snuck up close to your lady. Close your eyes and do some nap, and something nice is gonna happen. on with it.